You know how the world of Fallout was destroyed by a bunch of nuclear bombs hundreds of years before the start of the games? Well, according to Fallout series executive producer Todd Howard, there was only one nuclear strike in the Boston metropolitan area in the hit 2014 video game Fallout 4, which is, of course, the one you see during the prologue of the game. According to most people online, though, there were actually two detonations in the Boston area, that main one, and then a second one near the Cambridge Institute of Technology, as evidenced by this crater. Even more confusingly, according to the game's wiki pages, quote, further detonations beyond these two may have also occurred. So which one is it? A lot of people have theories about this online, and it's something that's been hotly debated for pretty much every Fallout game since Fallout 3. So what I decided to do is I scoured the internet and gathered up every potential nuclear strike location that anyone anywhere mentioned online for any reason, and then I hired a researcher to scour every inch of the Fallout 4 map and write down any additional locations in the game that have even the smallest bit of evidence of a nuclear explosion. And then once we had all those locations written down, we put them onto this map, and today we're going to go through all 14 of those potential locations. We're going to look at the actual details in these environments, like craters, destroyed buildings, and snapped trees, and we're going to determine once and for all how many bombs actually hit the Commonwealth in Fallout 4. Now, I will say, despite Todd Howard only ever really talking about the one main explosion in Fallout 4, he never actually explicitly said that there couldn't be more. A lot of people just misquote him on this, so I want to clear that up. And pretty much everyone agrees that there are at least two effectively confirmed nuclear strike locations present in the game, so let's start there. The first one, like I said, is all the way in the bottom corner of the map, and the evidence down there is pretty overwhelming. Aside from the massive, glowing, radioactive, inhospitable crater in the middle of the area, there are also crashed aircraft, destroyed buildings, and maybe the best piece of evidence of all, the trees here are all leaned away from the center of the blast in a circular pattern, classic sign of a powerful explosion. This crater is the one that was created by the bomb that your character sees go off during the game's prologue, and it's by far the largest bomb that we have direct evidence for in any of the 3D Fallout games. But the second widely accepted nuclear explosion location in Fallout 4 is pretty big as well, and it's called Cambridge Crater. Even though it's slightly less large than the first one, I'd say it's still pretty obvious that the game is trying to signal to us that this place was, in fact, destroyed by a nuclear weapon. There's a huge hole, there's a glowing puddle of radioactive waste, there's irradiated ghouls all around. The evidence, I would say, is overwhelming. Mostly. The one weird thing is that all of the buildings immediately outside of the crater itself here are largely intact. Some of them even have their windows completely unbroken, which I think would basically be impossible if it were this close to a nuclear detonation of any size. As far as stuff like this is concerned, we're basically gonna ignore it. Fallout is a game that takes a lot of creative liberties in order to give us interesting environments to walk around in. That's part of Bethesda's job as artists and game designers, and the scale of the game is much, much smaller than in real life. It's less than 1% as big as the real-life area of Boston that it's trying to represent, so we can expect that the scale of nuclear destruction is also going to vary pretty significantly. The underlying point here is that we can mark down these two locations as confirmed detonations. Aside from those two places, though, most of the other spots we're going to look are not going to have these big, obvious signs of a nuclear explosion. So, how are we going to determine which ones did have nuclear detonations and which ones did not? For our purposes, there are really three strong pieces of evidence that we're looking for. Firstly, obviously, if there is a crater or some other kind of indentation in the ground, that's a pretty good piece of evidence. Secondly, the type of location it is, like if it's a military base or some sort of other valid military or infrastructural target. And then thirdly, maybe the most important, is the pattern of how things are destroyed. You remember how I said that all of the trees near the first crater were tilted away from that central point? That sort of thing is very helpful in determining what might have happened in an area. Now, the tricky thing is, not every location is going to have all three of these things, and some of them might not appear to have any of them. So there's going to be some wiggle room for interpretation, but we'll cross that bridge when we're when we come to it. You know what I mean? So we've got 12 other locations to visit on our map here, and I think from my perspective, it makes sense to start down where the main detonation occurred and then head northeast. So we'll start by heading over here, which is this old town in an area called the Quincy Ruins. This is an area that was flagged by our researcher because of the many swampy indentations in the ground, almost like this was the site of a bunch of old nuclear detonations that deformed the landscape, as well as, general destruction all over the place, like these huge sections of of collapsed interstate highway. The thing is, the actual town itself is in pretty good shape. A lot of the buildings are intact, there's not overwhelming radiation anywhere, and that collapsed interstate even looks more like it fell straight down rather than getting blasted in a particular direction by an explosion. Now, I do agree with my researcher that from above, that swampy mess of indentations does bear some resemblance to those horrific photographs you can see of the aftermath of World War I artillery battles, but none of the trees here in Fallout 4 are knocked down in any consistent pattern. All the vegetation looks like stuff you would expect to see in a natural swamp anyway, and there's even old infrastructure here like this dock, which implies that this area was swampy and messy even before the war. So it's probably just a swamp, or a bog. I can't remember the difference. Straight north of this location, we find a place called Big John's Salvage, and just to the north of it, we find our next stop. At first glance, this looks pretty obvious. Not only do you have this huge crater with nasty yellow water in the middle, you can check that off the list, but take a close look at the pattern of destruction that we see around it. There was a road running over this area in the past, but if you line up where the road would have been with where it ended up, it's clearly shifted slightly to the left, away from the center of the crater. Then on the other side of the crater, you can see this massive billboard that's been destroyed, and it too has been tilted away from the center of the crater, but in the opposite direction. There's other evidence here as well, but the point is, the damage pattern here is absolutely consistent with a huge nuclear explosion. Now, is this a valid military target? I have no idea. You could say that it's infrastructure because of the bridges, or maybe they just meant to hit something else but they missed, but the evidence is strong enough that regardless, I think we can add a nice nuclear explosion icon to the map here. Now, technically, a lot of you are probably thinking, couldn't this just be a really big non-nuclear explosion, like a regular bomb? Yeah. Obvious, of course. Definitely. For the purpose of this video, we are just going to assume that all explosions during the war that destroyed the world of Fallout are nuclear bombs, because A, that seems more on brand for Fallout and it's more fun, but also there would just be no practical way of us determining a difference at this point. You can nitpick if you want, I'll fight you in the comments if you want, but that's the way we're doing it for the video, all right? For our third location, we're going to be looking at some buildings on the side of a lake in the town of Natick. This was one that some people brought up online, and it's obvious why some people think this is the site of an explosion. You've got a sort of crater-like depression here on the edge, and then the buildings all around the edge have the side facing the crater destroyed. But there's one key difference between this and the location that we just looked at. The buildings here aren't pushing away from the crater. They're falling into the crater. The pattern of destruction isn't right. It's much more likely that this isn't a crater, but it's erosion. And the fact that we're on the edge of a big lake makes perfect sense. The shore of this town has eroded over the years. There was a landslide at some point, probably semi-recently, judging by the state of the houses, and the buildings tumbled into the water. Additionally, this is just a random town, not some super obvious target for a bomb, so this, to me, is decidedly not a nuclear explosion. And I think our next location, which is up here near the water treatment plant, is also kind of a mixed bag. It was flagged by our researcher because of the general destruction, like a destroyed overpass and some trees that have been stripped or knocked over, as well as the fact that it's a perfect infrastructural target for a war, being a water treatment facility, but ultimately the evidence here is pretty weak. There's not actually a crater of any kind, and the pattern of destruction is sporadic and inconsistent, and the facility itself is completely intact despite being a valid target. So as far as we're concerned, this isn't a detonation either. And then our next stop, which is the last one before they start getting a little more complicated, is all the way on the west side of the map near an old military base called Fort Hagen. Obviously, military base equals very defensible target for a nuclear war, so we can strike that off our little checklist, but the rest of the evidence here is kind of hard to read. There are lots of snapped and bent trees to the east side of the base, there's extensive generalized destruction in the nearby town, and what would turn out to be the most important piece of evidence, there's a crashed airplane scattered into many pieces spread out over a wide area, like this piece of a wing that's being used as a makeshift shelter. So something clearly happened here. But what? I almost decided to skip this place and come back later when I remembered a bunch of comments that I got on my old Fallout 3 video about bomb locations, all of which mentioned something that I hadn't considered. Because it turns out there are 3 types of nuclear detonations. There are ground strikes where the bomb actually hits the ground before exploding, which is what creates the craters that we've seen so far. There are air bursts where the bomb explodes above the surface of the earth, which leave a very different mark on the landscape. And there are MeUndies. Welcome to the sponsorship. Okay, Okay, you caught me. There are actually only two types of nuclear detonations: air bursts and ground strikes. MeUndies isn't actually one of them. It's just a great product that you can purchase. I'm going to spend approximately 60 seconds trying to get you guys to wear the most comfortable underpants on Earth, and then I will explain to you why air bursts are important for the area that we're about to look at, okay? Okay, I've had my MeUndies for about 20 months now, almost 2 years, and they are still just as soft and enjoyable to wear as the day I got them. Look, let me get them. Oh, I actually think most of them are dirty. Okay, I'm not actually going to show them to you, but I'm wearing a pair right now. You can trust me, okay? In fact, I think if you put your MeUndies in a drawer, caused a nuclear apocalypse, waited 200 years in a vault, and then came out and went to go find them, they would still be just as soft and wearable as they were the day you bought them. Now, personally, I wear MeUndies boxer briefs, specifically the ones with the ball caddy feature, but I've heard from many people that I've recommended MeUndies to that their favorite products are things like their bralettes, their t-shirts, and their pajamas. Here is a real comment I got less than a week ago that illustrates that point. My wife decided to get rid of all my underwear that had holes in it, which left me with only 2 pairs of underwear. I ordered 3 pairs of Dino underwear on MeUndies using any Austin discount. I showed my wife, and she wanted me to only wear MeUndies brand. And I just ordered more underwear and got her 2 pairs of bras because she only has one. She only has one bra? Not my relationship. Now, is this actually a MeUndies employee in disguise? That's none of my business. But I choose to believe it's a real story, and I believe it's representative of the quality of the underpants that I wear every single day. Right now, as a listener of my show, you can get up to 50% off your first order plus free shipping at MeUndies.com/AnyAustin. Enter promo code AnyAustin. That's 50% off, free shipping. MeUndies.com/AnyAustin, promo code AnyAustin. If you're listening to this instead of watching, shout out. I guess maybe you're trying to go to sleep. Sweet dreams. Anyway. Okay, so really quick. Ground strikes, air bursts. Recap. So a ground strike is when a nuclear bomb hits the ground before exploding. This causes things like a clear crater, an obvious circular blast pattern, and at least in real life, a lot more radioactive fallout because it kicks up a lot more dirt. Full disclosure, ground strikes basically don't happen in real life because they're just such a mess, and they also don't work as good for blowing stuff up. So what we tend to use are air bursts. Unlike ground strikes, air bursts don't leave as obvious of craters. They can still leave craters, but not as obvious, and the damage pattern is much less uniform, and they leave very little lasting radioactive fallout. According to fans of Fallout who posted in my comments, the majority of nuclear detonations during the Great War in the game's lore were air bursts, not ground strikes. Now, this is directly contradicted by literally every detonation we actually see on screen, including the intro to Fallout 4 and the Fallout TV show, but hey, artistic license. Ground strikes look cooler on film. But with that in mind, let's go back to the Fort Hagen military base and look at what we see. So the fort itself is positioned next to a small town, and in that small town, lots of the buildings have whole chunks that have been totally destroyed and all of their windows have been blown out. The best example of this is this wooden house here. You can see where the wood has been completely snapped off all along the edges, which wouldn't happen if the wood was just naturally decaying over time. I think this was clearly ripped apart by force. Obviously, we have the same confusing inconsistencies here that we do everywhere in Fallout because the buildings right next door to this area are in perfect condition. But again, we're just chalking that up to how wonky the scale of these games is. The strongest evidence, though, comes when we look just a bit to the north of the fort itself. This is that big field we looked at where we see tons of dead trees, scarring marks in the ground, and tanks that were incapacitated while being used, as well as, crucially, pieces of a crashed aircraft spread all over. Now, Fallout 4 has several crashed airplanes in it, one of which we're going to look at in detail later on, but the thing that's important about this plane crash is precisely how it crashed. This plane is broken into several pieces, and those pieces are scattered all over the place. You've got the engine cowling here, you've got 2 pieces of the fuselage here, and then a piece of the wing all the way over here. The rest of the plane is nowhere to be found. All of this suggests that the plane was broken into several pieces while it was flying, and then those pieces fell to the ground at high speed, embedded themselves in different places deep into the dirt, or like most of it, they just simply shattered into thousands of tiny pieces, which is why we don't see them. And you know what would be strong enough to break a plane into pieces while it's still flying? Air burst nuclear bombs. So as far as our checklist, we've got no obvious crater, but this is a valid military target, and as long as we take airbursts into account, the pattern of destruction is consistent. And I actually think that given the widespread randomness of the destruction, we're looking at multiple airburst explosions here rather than just one big one. So we're going to use this nice airburst icon and put that onto our map. At this point, we've basically covered the southern half of the map, and we've found 4 locations that we think some kind of nuclear detonation occurred. The glowing sea, the crater near Big John Salvage, the Cambridge crater, and our new airbursts near Fort Hagen. But the other half of the map, all these places towards the north, are a lot more ambiguous than what we've looked at so far, and none of them are places that people online have mentioned as possible nuclear sites. These ones are all from our own in-house research, except the very last one, which is by far the most confusing location in the game, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So the next one we're going to look at is going to be this place here, which is another government facility of some kind called the Revere Satellite Array. I assume this place is named after the famous Paul Revere. Any Paul heads in the audience? No? No Paul heads out there? Revere fans? So this area was flagged because obviously it's a valid military target, and it does have some interesting patterns of destruction, the main one being this satellite dish that got knocked off its base at some point. But overall, on second glance, I don't know that it's a very compelling location. The best argument I heard was that a bomb went off in the air about here, which applied pressure in this direction, knocking down this overpass and blowing one of the satellite dishes off its hinge. But if we accept two pieces of infrastructure that fell down in the same direction as enough evidence, then we're going to end up adding like 20 other places to our list. So I don't think this is enough. You know, at the end of the day, yes, it's a valid target, but no craters, no compelling pattern of destruction. We are not going to be including it. Just a bit to the west of that, we have a little town called Malden, and in Malden, we find something fantastic. Another huge crater. Wow, add it to the list. Before we do, take 2 seconds to look at this crater and think about what you see. Because when I first got here, I was excited, as you just visually saw very authentically. I thought we had found another detonation site. But as I started to look closer, I realized that what we were looking at wasn't a detonation site at all. For one, look at all the buildings around it. These buildings are falling into the crater. Very clearly. If there really was a bomb here, the buildings would have been blown back away from the hole. They would not have fallen into it. And secondly, the real giveaway is this, a storm water drain pipe. This pipe is almost certainly part of a system of drains around the town that take in rainwater runoff and direct it to some nearby pond or lake. Just for fun, when I found this, I spent a minute going around the town to see if there really were storm drains, and there aren't really. I found this little spot, which kind of looks like one, but it also could just be some other model of something that was partially clipped into the ground. Oh well. But the amazing thing about this pipe in particular is that it still has water coming out of it, meaning, at least up until this point in the system, everything is intact. But the thing about infrastructure, as we talked about in our Where Winds Meet video just a couple of weeks ago, is that if you don't have anyone maintaining it, it's gonna break. And you know what happens when a pipe like this breaks? It gets a crack in it, the water leaks out, the ground around the pipe gets saturated, causing it to compact together, and eventually, boom, a sinkhole appears, swallowing up whatever's above it. And I think that's exactly what happened with this hole in Fallout 4. The game even has a little hole where the water is continuing to erode the ground, and if you jump into it, you can see a series of underground caverns, which could mean that more sinkholes are bound to form right in this area. Now, full disclosure, I actually know that I am 100% correct about this because as soon as I finished writing this section, I opened up the map and saw that there is a fast travel marker here called the Old Gullet Sinkhole. So I could have saved myself a lot of time, but whatever. The fact that the environment accurately reflects one of the ways a sinkhole could actually form in the post-apocalypse, though, I think that's extremely cool. But it does not meet our checklist criteria, so it is not a nuclear bomb site. Our next spot is pretty complicated, and it has to do with my favorite subject of all time. This is Skylanes Flight 1981. It's a passenger plane that was headed towards Boston Logan International Airport to the southeast, but it crashed short of the runway on the day that the bombs dropped. But the interesting thing about this crash compared to the one we looked at before is that this wreckage is pretty much completely intact, at least as far as plane crashes go. The wings, the tail, the fuselage, they're all roughly where they would be on a fully assembled plane. And none of it is burned, which means there was no fire when it impacted the ground. Additionally, if you look back towards where the plane would have been coming from, you can see that it clearly hits the overpass on the way down before it broke apart and landed in this field, which implies that unlike the rest of the airplane wreckages on this map, Skylanes 1981 was flying relatively slowly, and it was more or less under control when it crashed. It did not break into multiple pieces in the air. In the aviation world, we call this CFIT, or controlled flight into terrain, which makes it sound a lot nicer than it is. It is still a plane crash. It's just slightly less violent than if your plane breaks up into multiple pieces while it's still flying. You can actually hear this on the cockpit voice recorder, which is a little tape that they left in the game for you to listen to, where the pilots mention that they've lost their engines and that they're going to aim for the road, which implies that they still have some control of the aircraft, which means it probably wasn't directly hit by a nuclear bomb. But if that's the case, Why did this plane lose its engines and crash? The most likely explanation is that when the large nuke went off, the one that made the big crater in the glowing sea, it sent out an electromagnetic pulse, which is a thing that nuclear bombs do when they go off. I'm not going to explain it in detail right now, but an electromagnetic pulse is basically just this invisible wave that will break anything that runs on electricity. And unfortunately for the people in the Fallout universe, the engines of their aircraft do not run on jet fuel. They run on small nuclear reactors. And small nuclear reactors likely need to be controlled and maintained by computers. Electromagnetic pulse means no computer. No computer means no more engine. No more engine means no more thrust. No more thrust. Crash into an overpass and die. And, sorry to keep going on about this plane, but I'm obsessed with its design. You know how fuel in real life is stored in the wings of airplanes? Well, since airplanes in Fallout don't use jet fuel like liquid fuel, guess what? They actually put seating and windows in the wings of this plane because they don't need them to store all the gas. That is such a cool detail to have thought about. Wow. So this plane is an awesome piece of environmental storytelling, but without craters, a valid target, or a clear pattern of destruction, it is not evidence of another nuclear strike in Fallout 4. Ironically, our next stop is where this plane wishes it could have made it to, Boston Logan International Airport. There's a lot of fun stuff to look at here if you have the time, but by far the most important piece of evidence in this area is going to be this nondescript piece of debris at the edge of the terminal. This, I think, is meant to be a jet bridge. Like, you know those things that you walk through to get from your gate onto the plane? Those extendable walkway things? That's what this is. Obviously, this one is broken. You know, you can't walk on it. But let's try to imagine what it might have looked like when it was functional. You'd have the jet bridge extending out kind of like this, and at the end, you'd have a plane that would have to park up against it so people could get on, maybe taking up about this much space. In theory, that plane would also need space to maneuver, and then there have to be a runway somewhere for it to take off, which is probably in this direction somewhere. Now, obviously, like we said, scale in Fallout games is incredibly funny and variable. But even if we assume it's a small runway and an airport with just a single terminal, the implication of this broken jet bridge and the size of it is that most of Boston Logan International Airport is gone. Because where those things would have to be is just water now. And I think the reason that it's gone is because it was bombed by nuclear bombs. You see, Boston Airport sits on top of a very swampy, marshy piece of land, so slamming a bunch of bombs into it would easily cause it to collapse, flood, and sort of fall beneath the sea. And if you go under the water near the terminal, you'll see that this land isn't like it's not like this was just rising sea level swallowing up the flat runways. The land under the water is like completely deformed. So just like the military base from earlier, I think though we're missing an outright crater, it's obviously a plausible military target being an airport, and the pattern of destruction could be perfectly explained by a mix of airbursts, which destroy the infrastructure, and then ground strikes that deformed the land itself, causing it to flood. So that's another new nuclear strike location for our list. We're nearly done with every location, and so far we've concluded that there are at least 5 places in Fallout 4 that are at least plausible places that nuclear weapons were used during the events of the Great War. The question now is, will we add to this number with these last 3 locations, or is that the full count? If you're going to make a guess, now's the time. The first spot we need to check is up here. This was one of several locations that was flagged by our researcher specifically because the Fallout 4 height map indicated an unnatural circular depression in the ground. So for some of this research, we used this height map that comes directly from satellite imagery of the play area, which I know is kind of cheating, but it just seemed like a fun idea. And if you look here, you can see the area that we're talking about. The assumption was that if we came to places like this on the height map, we might see some sort of large crater. But in actuality, this ended up being a pretty poor way of finding nuclear craters because a lot of them are just man-made structures like this quarry here, which looks circular from above. In fact, pretty much every crater that we have found is imperceptible on the height map. The Cambridge crater would be around here, and then Big John's salvage crater is around here, and it's basically impossible to see either of them. So as fun of an idea as it was to use the height map for crater searching, it ultimately just sent us on a bunch of wild goose chases, which is why we're removing this location and all the others from our list. And then location number 13, which is south of Parsons Creamery, is is one that I actually stumbled across while walking from point to point. There's this unexplained circular depression here in the middle of the road that fills up with water when it rains, but if you look under the water, you can see that the road itself has been pulverized into tiny pieces. Ultimately, I think the most likely explanation is that this was caused by some sort of mini nuke or like conventional explosive sometime over the last 200 years since the war. Just the idea that something this small could have been caused by a conventional nuclear weapon feels pretty far-fetched to me. You might be able to argue about that, but for me, this doesn't count. So with those two options gone, we get to our last place on this long journey, the most confusing place of all, number 14, Crater House. This is a place that people online have mentioned as a nuclear strike location, but are they correct? Well, the name sure makes it sound promising, right? And the icon on the map is literally a nuclear radiation symbol. So I thought this was a shoo-in for a new location, meaning we would end the video with 6 total detonations, triple what the conventional wisdom says. And then when you get down here, there's a lot of compelling evidence. The first thing you'll notice is that this area is occupied by people called the Children of Adam, who are this sort of religion/cult that worships nuclear weapons and radiation. Famously, the Children of Adam can be found inside the crater from the very first bomb we saw in the game, and over the course of all the Fallout games, they typically reside in or near nuclear bombs and craters, like in Fallout 3, which definitely makes this seem like a nuclear crater. But if you look closely at the crater itself, you'll see something familiar. A crash airplane. A lot of plane crashes in this game. And that makes it seem like this crater was created by a crashing plane, not a nuclear weapon. And to be fair, that doesn't mean the Children of Adam wouldn't worship here. Remember how we said that planes in Fallout use nuclear engines to operate? That means that if one crashes hard enough to destroy those nuclear reactors, it could create some kind of radioactive disaster area, which is perfect for creepy cults that love to get, cancer and irradiated. But the thing is, crashing planes, especially ones without fuel, don't really explode. And they definitely don't create craters. If you watch plane crash footage, which I don't recommend, but you can, you don't see craters, right? Remember that airplanes are designed to be relatively light, which means most of their volume is air. So when one of them hits the ground, especially at high speed, it is much more likely to just disintegrate basically on impact, rather than create any kind of significant mark or crater. On top of that, look around the edge of this crater and what do you see? You see that all of the trees and even the ground itself, they all point away from the center of the crater in a circle. Even if we were to accept that the plane alone caused the crater, which is not really possible, even if that were the case, the force of that impact would be in one direction because it's a plane crash moving in one direction. But here on opposite sides of the crater, you've got trees that are bent in the complete opposite direction of one another, as though snapped in half by some sort of central explosion. This really is by far the most confusing and contradictory location environmentally. I'm pretty sure that from Bethesda's perspective, they were basically just thinking that if an airplane with nuclear engines crashes, it would create a nuclear explosion, which would make a crater, which is not correct, but it's again, artistic license, art, fun, video games, whatever. But let's ignore what Bethesda intended and pretend that this is a real place. If we stumbled across this, would it qualify as a nuclear detonation site based on the evidence? Can we change our final number from 5 sites to 6? The way I see it, there's only one explanation for how something like this could have occurred, and I don't think you're going to like it, but as far as I'm concerned, this area does count as a nuclear detonation site, and here's why. The only thing that can explain how this is both a plane crash site and an irradiated nuclear cesspool and an explosive crater is if somebody was trying to bomb the nearby Museum of Witchcraft or perhaps the industrial plant, but they missed hitting a random spot along the shore, creating a crater. Then right after that, the very airplane that launched the nuclear missile lost control of itself because the pilot was distracted by how bad their aim was, which caused the plane to enter a stall spin situation, and it fell out of the sky, impacting the ground in the exact same spot as the very crater that it had just created. And I feel like crazier things and funnier things have happened in Fallout lore, which does mean, according to my expert environmental analysis, the total number of nuclear strike locations in Fallout 4 is not 1, not 2, but 6 total nuclear detonations. Somebody go update the wiki page for me. I'm Austin. Thanks for watching. I see you rise